Beacon Press Audio presents The Fight for Sex Ed, the century-long battle between truth and doctrine, by Margaret Grace Myers. This audiobook is narrated by Diana Gardiner, published by Beacon Press Audio, 2025. Preface, Then and Now. When I first got the idea that would become this book, it was 2017. Roe v. Wade still stood. Critical race theory had not yet been weaponized in schools, and the book-banning movement had yet to reach its chilling peak. As for myself, I was not yet 30. I was in a nonfiction MFA program, and I believed I knew exactly what I wanted to write about. I was conducting research about my great-grandparents, who had worked in Baltimore as biologists at the turn of the 20th century. I was planning to center my MFA thesis on them, but my attention quickly shifted. I became drawn into their world. They had been close friends with a number of social hygienists, people who were dedicated to eradicating the social evil, the euphemism of the day for sex work. In Baltimore, as in many American cities at this time, brothels were legal but were confined to a red light district. The people in my great-grandparents' circles, doctors and suffragists, motivated by what they saw as the dangers of both the health and moral aspects of sex work, generally believed that the women who were employed in brothels were victims of a complex matrix of factors, including industrialization, isolation, and boredom. They also believed that sex work was the root cause of the burgeoning epidemic of sexually transmitted infections, STIs, that was ravaging their city. One of the ways they hoped to end sex work, and so this epidemic, was by undertaking an educational campaign about the many and varied risks of extra and premarital sex. But even among allies, there was very little agreement about whom exactly should be educated or what that education should consist of. When reading about debates on the topic from more than a century prior, I realized that many of the questions felt familiar. Even in my own context, I had heard all of the questions in my own life. At what age should a person be taught about sex? Does instruction on how to prevent pregnancy and infection encourage promiscuity? What are the right qualities of a sex educator? Where, ideally, should sex ed take place? At home, at church, or in school? These questions felt alive and present in my own reality. The seed of this book came to me then, but it grew when I realized how very expansive the story of sex ed is. The history of the subject contains stories of American public schools, of the Red Scare, and of the religious right. It is also a narrative about politics, protest, social change, children, science, and medicine. Above all, it is a story of how difficult it is to solve real problems that have no clear answers in a highly politicized atmosphere. This book is also very much about our society today. In the introduction to his book, Post-War America, Howard Zinn wrote, "Any book of history is, consciously or not, an interpretation in which selected data from the past is tossed into the present according to the interest of the historian. That interest, no matter how much the historian's mind dwells on the past, is always a present one." I carried this thought with me as I worked on The Fight for Sex Ed and watched as a pandemic unfolded in front of me, as Roe v. Wade was reversed, and as school districts became battlegrounds over not just sex ed, but also critical race theory, transgender students on sports teams, and book bans targeting work on climate change. The science fiction author Robert Heinlein once posited that every generation believes that they invented sex. After writing this book, I also think it's fair to say that each generation also thinks they invented sex ed. And, as Heinlein continues, each generation is totally mistaken. As I researched and wrote this book, I was at first bemused and then almost laughably frustrated by the way the debates about sex ed repeated themselves across time and space with uncanny similarity. This may be in part due to the fact that our culture has crafted no overarching narrative about the history of sex ed, no story about when it emerged, why it was first needed, what early advocates thought it could accomplish, and no popular understanding that sex ed has long been the subject of intense political and religious debate. There is, therefore, a sort of cultural amnesia around sex ed, little sense of the real work that has been done on it or the long history in which it is situated. This is why, in school districts across the nation, sex ed is still often perceived as an experiment, just as it has been for more than a century, partly the result of purposeful efforts by those who want young people to remain ignorant of their bodies and of sex. All of this amnesia and obfuscation has made the job of constructing this narrative pretty difficult. I probably made it more difficult by my love of diving deeply into primary sources. I constructed most of the action in this book from newspaper archives, grateful every day for the wonders of the internet, from which I plumbed the most interesting, maddening, and compelling instances of fights about sex ed. From there, a narrative began to come into focus. With the help of secondary sources, books and articles on history, religion, politics, and sexual health, I hope I have been able to put forth a convincing and accurate story of the fight for sex ed. Jeffrey P. Moran's 2000 book, Teaching Sex, Janice Irvine's 2002 Talk About Sex, and Kristen Luker's 2006 When Sex Goes to School were all especially helpful. If my book does nothing else, I hope it can tell the story of American sex ed for readers in the 2020s, a time as unique as any other. Because how we talk about sex, public health, and reproductive justice is a live wire, present and hot and very real. And tied up in it all is the history of sex ed. I feel lucky to have carried this work with me for so long, and in the process, to have read and watched and asked questions, to have had my ideas challenged, and to have arrived at genuinely new conclusions. Now I feel lucky to get to share the result with listeners. Chapter 1. Dr. Prince Morrow and the Birth of Sexual Health Advocacy in America. New York City in 1901 had no Woolworth Building, no Chrysler Building, no Empire State Building, no Grand Central Terminal, no Pennsylvania Station. There was no New York City subway, no Williamsburg or Manhattan Bridge. Immigration was flourishing, and the city's total population stood at 3.5 million. The Statue of Liberty had not yet completely turned from copper brown to oxidized green. Men donned suits and hats, women wore long dresses. It would be easy to assume that the people in the dapper crowds who walked the cobblestone streets, stopping to buy an oyster from an open cart, scandalized by the sight of a woman's ankle, had sexual lives as prim as their topcoats. But the truth was very different. Syphilis and marriage. In 1882, Prince Albert Morrow, a New York City doctor whose practice specialized in sexually transmitted infections, STIs, published his English translation of a French book entitled Syphilis et Mariage, written by physician Jean-Alfred Fournier. In it, Fournier described the troubling phenomena he was witnessing as a doctor who treated STIs. His male patients were coming to him with complicated questions. If a man had a past infection but hadn't been symptomatic in years, could he, in good conscience, now marry? Would future children be affected by present infections? Some of the questions medicine alone couldn't solve. If a patient contracted an infection outside of marriage, could he take steps to prevent its spread without his wife knowing? What information about his condition did the patient owe his wife? And what information, for that matter, did the doctor owe his patient's wife? These were complicated human and moral conundrums. Morrow was evidently quite moved by Fournier's writing, and in his translator's preface he wrote, "There is scarcely
Sample complete. Ready to continue?